In the age of Viking kings, longhouses were more than just homes, they were the heart of Norse life. Built from scratch, using wood, turf and thatch, these grand halls stood as symbols of power, shelter and community. Constructing a longhouse required skill, teamwork and deep knowledge of the land. From raising sturdy timber frames to insulating with earth, Viking kings and their people created lasting structures. Let's explore how these legendary rulers built longhouses that shaped their world. The tale begins with firelight flickering on cold faces, a chieftain's voice heavy with command, and the weight of expectation hanging thick as smoke. How Viking kings built longhouses from scratch was not a matter of idle craft, nor the whim of a ruler who sought shelter from the rain. It was a question of power, survival, and the echo of their name in the sagas yet to come. A Viking king who did not raise a hall was no true ruler at all, for without the longhouse there was no seat of law, no gathering of warriors, no feast to bind his people with loyalty and pride. The king's vision came before timber was felled or earth disturbed. He saw in his mind the hall blazing with torches, benches groaning beneath platters of Viking food, the sound of harp and horn filling rafters that stretched like the ribs of a ship toward the heavens. To build a longhouse was to build more than walls and a roof. It was to shape the very heart of a settlement, a place where every Viking, man, woman, and child would measure their lives in laughter, quarrels, bargains, and songs. In the eyes of his people, the hall was more than a home. It was the measure of a king's worth. Travellers arriving from distant fjords would look upon its height, smell its smoke, and know at once the strength of the lord who dwelled within. Without it, a king was no more than a warrior with a crown, unmoored, lacking roots. With it, he commanded permanence. The longhouse was his throne, his fortress, and his soul bound into timber. Such visions were not born from ease. They came in the hush before dawn, when the king stood alone upon the chosen ground, his breath steaming in the cold air, his hand brushing the soil that would cradle his people's hearth. He thought of winters where storms howled like wolves, of raids when strangers came with fire, of lean seasons when every grain of stored barley meant the difference between life and death. The longhouse must hold against all of these, a living wall of wood and will. Yet ambition alone could not raise beams or carve pillars. The king's vision had to move men as surely as wind fills a sail. He called his warriors, his craftsmen, his farmers, and his skalds, speaking of the hall that would rise like a ship of earthbound glory. He spoke of feasts where warriors would boast of their battles, of a hearth where tales would outlast generations, of a roof so strong it would shelter the cries of newborn Viking children and the last sighs of grey-haired elders. When the king spoke, men saw more than logs and labour. They saw their place in something greater, for the longhouse was not simply the dwelling of their ruler, it was their own flesh and blood bound in timber. The Viking who cut the oak could boast his axe had shaped the very roof above his lord's head. The woman who wove the first wall hangings knew her craft would glow in firelight, seen by guests from across the sea. Even the smallest child, carrying twigs to feed the hearth, would remember that his hands had kindled the flame that warmed kings. Thus the vision spread like sparks across dry grass, until all the village burned with the desire to see it made real. In the mind of the king, it was already standing, vast and proud, smoke rising through its roof holes, laughter rolling out into the cold night. The hall was the promise of safety and glory, of kinship and memory, and so, with vision clear and hearts roused, the true work began. The ground was never chosen lightly. When a Viking king declared that a longhouse must rise, the land itself became the first test of his wisdom. Choosing the sacred ground was as vital as timber or stone, for if the earth was wrong, no craft of man could make the hall endure. The king would walk the fields in silence, his cloak drawn close, eyes fixed upon the lay of hills, the curl of rivers, and the whisper of the wind through grass. To build where the land was weak was to invite ruin, but to set the posts where strength and spirit dwelled was to give the Longhouse a soul that would outlast the king himself. It was not the king's decision alone. Farmers were summoned to speak of the soil, of whether it would drink too deep of rain or crack with drought. Warriors strode at his side, seeking vantage where watchfires might spot an enemy long before the clash of steel. Seers muttered of omens, tracing shapes in the flight of ravens or the curling smoke of their herbs. One might say the spirits dwelled in a hill, another that a certain stream carried blessings of the old gods. The Viking people believed that land remembered, that every stone and hollow held echoes of battles, feasts, and prayers once spoken. To ignore such memory was folly. The king listened to all, though his will weighed heaviest. He sought a place where the hall would not only stand, but command, where its roof would be seen from far paths, where its fires would glow like a beacon against the endless dark of winter. A Viking man's house was his pride, but the king's longhouse was his dominion. From its threshold he would welcome allies, judge disputes, and feast until dawn. The site had to bear such burdens in silence, strong and unwavering. Sometimes the choice was steeped in symbolism. A meadow where ancestors had fought a great battle, where blood had darkened the ground, might be claimed so that every feast reminded warriors of their duty. Other times, the chosen ground was holy, marked by ancient stones or the roots of a sacred tree. To set the high seat posts, there was to bind the favour of gods to the roof beams. Even the smallest sign mattered: a fox darting across the path, a sudden stillness of birds. Such things could sway hearts more than the counsel of wise men. Yet the decision was not all spirit. Water was life. A longhouse too far from a stream would wither in thirst, its people worn by endless carrying of buckets. But build too near, and floods might tear the hall apart in spring's fury. The soil itself told its tale firm enough to anchor the posts, but not so hard that men's backs would break before the first trench was dug. The king would test it with his own hand, pressing his palm to the ground as though feeling the heartbeat of the earth. When the place was finally chosen, it was marked with ceremony. The king himself might drive the first stake, or the seer would bury offerings of grain, mead, or even the bones of beasts to bind the spirits in peace. A Viking child might be led forward to scatter flowers or ash, a sign that the hall was for generations yet to come. Voices rose in chant, calling the gods to witness. From that moment, the earth belonged to the hall. Thus, the sacred ground was not merely soil, but destiny. A poor choice could doom a king's reign, yet the right one could see his hall endure for centuries, its timbers whispering long after his bones were dust. In that choosing lay the true beginning of every longhouse, the breath before the first axe struck wood, the silence before the saga began. The chosen land was never empty. It was tangled with roots, bristling with trees that had stood for centuries, stones half buried like the bones of giants, and marshes that sucked at boots as though the earth itself wished to drag men down. To raise a longhouse here, the wild had to be tamed. Clearing the wild was the first raw effort, the battle against nature itself, and it was as fierce as any clash of swords. The king's men gathered at dawn, axes gleaming, voices carried on the cold air. A Viking man did not take an axe to a tree lightly. The old belief was that spirits dwelled in oak and ash, and to cut without respect was to bring their wrath. So, offerings were made: bread, mead, sometimes a sliver of silver pressed into the roots before the iron bit deep into bark. Then came the ringing thud, the groan of timber, and the final crash as a giant fell. Every tree that toppled was a victory, but each swing of the axe stole strength from the arms of those who wielded it. Men returned with shoulders raw and hands blistered, yet the forest thinned day by day under their will. The stones were no less stubborn. Great boulders jutted from the ground, immovable as if the gods themselves had placed them there to test mortal patience. Lines of men with ropes strained, heaving until veins stood out in their necks. When the largest would not yield, fires were lit against them, water poured to crack the stone, and hammers swung until shards split away. Children watched wide-eyed, seeing their fathers force the bones of the earth to move. Each stone, dragged aside, became part of the new order, some laid to mark paths, others destined to line the hearth or reinforce the longhouse walls. Marshland was the most treacherous foe. What seemed a patch of solid ground could swallow a Viking child to the waist in a heartbeat. Warriors thrust poles deep into the muck, measuring its depth, and together they laid down brush, logs, and layers of turf until the bog grew firm. The smell of damp rot clung to the air, but every stretch of marsh drained was another piece of land claimed for the hall and for the people who would feast inside it. Through it all, the king stood watch. He lent his hand when needed, setting an example that none could call him idle. His vision of the longhouse gave strength to weary arms. At night, when fires burned along the cleared edges, men spoke of the progress they had made. They dreamed aloud of sitting within the hall, eating Viking food on long benches, hearing skalds sing where now only wolves howled. The forest still loomed around them, dark and untamed, but each day it receded further, pushed back by sweat and steel. Clearing the wild was not simply labour, it was the first declaration of mastery. Where once only beasts prowled and roots tangled, now space opened for hearth and kinship. The people saw the ground change beneath their feet, and with it their own fortunes. The work bound them together, forging pride as strong as iron. And when at last the earth lay bare, the stumps blackened, the stones heaped, and the marsh drained, the skeleton of the hall could already be imagined rising from the soil. The wild had been broken, and the land now answered to the will of the king. The wild was cleared, but a longhouse could not rise from barren ground alone. It demanded timber great beams that could hold the weight of roof and rafters, sturdy planks to guard against storm and spear, wood that would endure through the years, like the bloodline of the king himself. Timber worthy of a king was not chosen at random. Each tree was sought as carefully as a bride, inspected, judged, and revered, for in every oak or pine dwelled a spirit older than men. To take it was to strike a bargain with the unseen. The king's foresters strode deep into the forest at dawn, their axes slung over their shoulders, their eyes sharp for the giants that might serve the hall. A Viking man knew his trees, as a farmer knew his soil. Oaks for strength, their grain dense and unyielding, perfect for high seat posts that would never bow. Pines for the soaring beams, straight and tall, lifting the roof like the ribs of a ship. Birch for its pale beauty, to be carved into doors and panels, welcoming light into the shadowed hall. Each kind of wood carried its own gift, each chosen for its place in the hall's body. Before the first blow was struck, there was silence. The men laid their hands on the bark, whispering prayers to the spirits within. Some poured mead at the roots, others tied scraps of cloth to the branches, tokens of respect. For it was believed that to anger the spirit of a tree was to curse the timber, and with it the longhouse itself. A hall raised on wrath would not stand long. Storms would tear its roof, fires would leap upon its beams, and misfortune would stalk those who feasted within. When the axe finally bit, the sound rang like a war drum through the forest. Chips flew, sweat glistened, and the tree groaned as though protesting the wound. Men took turns at the task, each swing measured, steady, a rhythm that echoed in their bones. Then, with a cracking roar, the giant toppled, shaking the earth as it fell. A Viking child watching from the edge of the clearing might tremble at the sight, knowing he had just witnessed a spirit leave its home and give itself to the king. The fallen trunks were stripped of branches, their bark peeled away to reveal the pale strength beneath. They were dragged by oxen or rolled on logs, every movement hard won. Songs rose with the labour, chants to keep the rhythm and to honour the gift of the forest. In those moments, work became ceremony, toil became offering. Men laughed and shouted, but beneath it all was reverence, for they knew the hall's bones were being gathered piece by piece. The king himself would walk among the chosen timbers, running his hand along their length, approving or rejecting with the weight of his vision. A cracked trunk was discarded, a crooked beam left behind. Only the best would serve, for the hall was not merely shelter, it was the heart of the people, the measure of the king's power, and the place where sagas would be spoken long after his death. To build with weak timber was to build with shame. As the piles of oak, pine, and birch grew, so too did the sense of destiny. Each beam whispered of the feast it would shelter, each plank dreamed of the firelight it would reflect. The forest had given up its giants, and in their sacrifice a hall was promised. The timber lay ready, silent yet full of purpose, waiting to be raised into the shape of a king's vision. And when that day came, the spirits of those trees would rise again, not as woodland guardians, but as the living walls and soaring roof of a Viking longhouse. The forest grew restless when the axes began to sing. Their sharp cries rang through the morning air, iron biting into wood, each stroke a promise that the longhouse would rise. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, sweat steaming in the chill, their breaths matching the rhythm of steel on bark. A Viking man knew his axe as well as his sword balanced in hand, faithful in battle, and now called to carve not flesh but destiny. The first cuts were slow, deliberate. The trunk shuddered beneath the blows, chips flying in bright bursts, the scent of sap, thick and sharp. The sound carried far, echoing against the hills like a war chant, so that even those beyond the clearing knew that something mighty was being wrought. One by one, the forest giants groaned and leaned, then toppled with a roar, shaking the ground like thunder. Children who had followed their fathers to watch gasped and clutched their mothers, feeling the earth tremble as if the gods themselves stamped their feet in approval. Axes were not alone in their song. Adzes rasped, shaping timbers where they lay, stripping bark, squaring edges, smoothing surfaces to fit tight against their fellows. Teams of men rolled trunks with poles, shouting in unison as they shifted the massive weight. It was dangerous work. A slip of footing or a trunk rolling free could crush a man in an instant. Yet the labour bound them together. Each cut, each heave, each shouted rhythm was a verse in the same song, the melody of creation sung by iron and muscle. The king's presence lingered at the edge of the clearing. He did not strike every blow, his role was heavier still, but he set his hand to an axe when the first giant fell, so none could say he demanded labour he would not share. Warriors, farmers, even thralls bent their backs to the task. In that moment, all were united, for the longhouse would belong to every soul who entered its smoke-darkened beams. The workday was long, but the voices did not falter. Songs rose between strikes, rough and booming, tales of old battles, prayers to the gods, or teasing jests to keep the spirit light. A skald with quick tongue might turn the steady thudding into verse, likening the fall of a tree to the death of a foe, or to the collapse of mountains. When the axes sang, so too did the hearts of the men, lifted above the weight of their toil. By dusk, the ground was strewn with trunks, the air heavy with the smell of resin. The men gathered around small fires, eating Viking food of bread, dried meat, and steaming broth. Blisters burned, shoulders ached, but there was pride in their eyes. They had wrestled giants from the earth, and tomorrow more would fall. A Viking child crouched by the embers, tracing shapes in the chips of wood, imagining the hall already built, its roof high and golden in the firelight. The forest had begun to yield, not in silence, but in song. The axes carried a voice of iron that declared the will of the people, the strength of the king, and the promise of the hall to come. Each tree that fell was another line in the saga, another step from wilderness to order. And though the night swallowed the clearing, and the fires dimmed, the echo of that song lingered in the dark, a rhythm that would not end until the longhouse itself stood, proud and unshakable. The forest lay humbled, its giants felled, yet the work was far from done. A longhouse could not rise from raw trunks alone. They had to be tamed, shaped, and bent to the king's vision. This was the time when rough logs became straight beams, when chaos of the wild was turned into ordered strength. The shaping of beams was not a task for mere brawn, but for skill, patience, and the steady hand of craftsmen, whose craft bordered on sacred. At dawn, the carpenters stepped forward, their tools gleaming with a sharper hunger than any sword. The Viking man who wielded an adze, or broad axe, was as much an artist as a warrior. He saw not a log lying crooked on the ground, but the beam hidden within it, waiting to be revealed. With each strike, he shaved away bark and splinter, drawing out clean lines, true edges, and surfaces, smooth enough to bear the weight of rafters and roof. The work began with hewing. 2 men stood over a trunk, scoring deep lines along its length with heavy axes, the sound ringing like drums in the cold morning. Then came the broad axe, swung with precision to split the wood along the marked path, each blow cleaving away the roughness. Chips flew like sparks, piling at their feet, while the straight, pale heart of the timber slowly emerged. A Viking child who dared to peek too close would be scolded, for the tools bit deeper than teeth, and the beams weighed more than oxen. Once the rough form was cut, the adzes took over. Men walked along the beams, their arms rising and falling in a steady rhythm, shaving the wood with curved blades that left it smooth and true. The scent of fresh timber filled the air, sweet and sharp, clinging to hair and clothes until the whole camp smelled of the forest reborn. It was said that one could tell a master carpenter by the song of his strokes, clean, even, each echo carrying confidence that the hall would stand straight for generations. Not every piece of wood was destined for greatness. A cracked trunk might betray itself after the first cut, discarded with curses to be used for lesser tasks. But those that endured the shaping became the very bones of the longhouse. The king himself would sometimes walk among the beams, placing his hand on one and declaring it fit for the high seat or the roof ridge. In that moment, the tree that once whispered to the wind was claimed as the backbone of a kingdom. The carpenters marked their work with pride, small cuts or runes carved at the ends of beams, signs that this piece bore their hand. Long after, when the smoke-blackened hall echoed with feasts and songs of Viking food shared among warriors, those marks remained, silent signatures of the men who shaped the frame. The labour was endless, each beam demanding hours of toil, yet there was satisfaction in the order emerging from the chaos. Where once lay a forest floor littered with rough logs, now stacks of straight beams rested, ready to be raised. The men sat by their work at dusk, hands raw, muscles trembling, but their eyes saw more than wood. They saw walls rising, a roof stretching to the sky, the glow of firelight against carved posts. The shaping of beams was more than preparation, it was transformation. The forest no longer lay wild and untamed, it had been claimed, measured, and given purpose. Each beam carried the memory of the axe and the sweat of men, but also the promise of the hall to come. And as night fell, the sound of hewing and shaving still echoed in their dreams, as if even in sleep the beams continued to form themselves, eager to stand as the longhouse of a Viking king. Among all the timbers gathered and shaped, there were some set apart from the rest logs chosen not for their size alone, but for the weight of spirit they carried. These became the sacred posts, the very soul of the longhouse, and none dared treat them as ordinary wood. A Viking king knew that his hall would be judged not only by the strength of its roof or the breadth of its walls, but by the power of the high seat posts, for they anchored more than beams, they anchored the destiny of his kin. The selection of these posts began before the first axe ever touched bark. The king walked the forest with his seer, eyes sharp for signs. Perhaps it was a tree where ravens perched, or one whose roots twined with stone as though gripping the earth itself. Sometimes the choice came in a dream, a vision of a certain oak or pine lit by unseen fire. When the tree was found, offerings were laid at its roots, mead poured into the soil, bread crumbled for the spirits, and whispered prayers to Odin, Thor, and Frey. Only then would the axe bite, and when it did, The blows were solemn, almost ritual, as though each strike freed the spirit within. Once felled, the logs were stripped and shaped with a reverence rarely given to wood. Carvers bent over them for days, sometimes weeks, etching runes that called for protection, strength, and prosperity. Spirals of beasts ran along their sides. Serpents to coil around enemies, wolves to guard the hall, ravens to carry words to the gods. Some posts bore scenes of sagas, ancestors locked in eternal struggle, so that every glance at the carving reminded warriors of the blood and glory behind their name. A Viking child, tracing the grooves with small fingers, might learn his first letters from these runes, taught that his very life was bound to the spirit of the posts. The high seat posts were more than decoration, they were the hall's living guardians. Placed at the seat of the king, they framed the place where law was spoken, oaths sworn, and judgments passed. Warriors swore loyalty beneath their gaze, and to lie there was to risk the wrath of gods and men alike. Feasts, too, were held in their presence. When Viking food was laid out on heavy boards, when horns of mead clashed in toast, the posts stood silent, their carved beasts seeming to watch with unblinking eyes, witnesses to every boast and bargain. There were tales that some posts carried omens. One king's hall was said to shake when his reign drew near its end, the posts groaning like voices in the night. Another carved his with such skill that visitors claimed the eyes of the beasts glowed in the firelight, alive with something more than human craft. For this reason, no one touched the high seat posts without permission. They were kissed by brides at wedding feasts, embraced by warriors before setting out to sea, and even appealed to by mothers praying for safe birth. When the time came to raise them, it was done with ceremony. Men chanted as they heaved the posts upright, ropes straining, the carved heads rising slowly toward the sky. The king himself poured mead at their base as the earth swallowed their roots, binding them forever to soil and hall. The moment they stood, the longhouse had a heart. Before walls, before roof, it was already alive, its spirit rooted in those sacred posts. And so they remained through generations, blackened by smoke, polished by countless hands, yet never losing their power. Long after the king's bones returned to the earth, the posts still stood, silent keepers of memory and witness to the endless cycle of feasting, battle, and kinship. In them, the longhouse endured, a soul of wood and rune stronger than time itself. The forest had given its giants, and the carvers had given spirit to the sacred posts, but a longhouse could not stand until its bones were rooted in the earth. Foundations in earth were more than pits and timbers, they were the binding of sky to soil, the moment when vision left the realm of words and dreams and became a shape men could see. Without this step, the beams lay idle, lifeless. With it, the skeleton of the hall began to rise. The king ordered the ground marked at dawn, his men driving stakes where each post hole would be dug. Lines stretched across the bare clearing, measured by rope and eye, so that every corner fell true, and the hall would stand balanced against storm and time. A Viking man bent to the task with spade and mattock, carving trenches into the soil until his back burned and sweat fell dark into the dirt. The deeper they dug, the more the earth resisted, as if reluctant to yield its strength. Roots clung to the soil like fingers, stones had to be pried loose with poles, and sometimes water seeped up from hidden veins, turning the pits into mud. Still the work continued, for all knew that shallow holes meant weak posts, and weak posts meant a hall that could fall in the first winter gale. When the holes were ready, the timbers were dragged forward with ropes and heaving backs. The sacred posts came first, their carved beasts gleaming where the adzes had bitten. Men knelt before lowering them, whispering a last prayer to the gods, and then, with shouts and straining arms, they heaved them upright. Ropes tightened, poles braced, and the posts rose slowly into the sky, their carved heads tilting higher with each heartbeat, until at last they stood, towering and still, their bases swallowed by the soil. The ground shuddered, as if it had taken them in like roots. A Viking child watching from the edge might clutch his mother's hand, awed to see the first bones of the hall standing tall against the horizon. One by one, the other timbers followed, oaks for the corner posts, pine for the central beams, each set in its place with care. The sound of mallets filled the clearing as men hammered earth and stone back into the pits, packing it tight around the wood. Some poured mead or blood into the hole before sealing it, offerings to strengthen the bond between timber and soil. In this way, each post was not only anchored in the ground, but in the spirit of the land itself. By midday, the outline of the hall stretched across the earth like the ribs of a giant beast. Shadows fell between the posts, already suggesting the walls and roof that would come. The king walked among them, his cloak trailing in the dust, his hand brushing the wood as he passed. Here would stand the high seat, there the hearth, beyond it the benches, where Viking food would be served in abundance. To the untrained eye, it was still only timber and earth, but to the king and his people, the hall had already begun to breathe. As dusk came, the last posts were secured, their shadows long across the ground. Fires were lit, and men sat among the standing beams, their voices echoing strangely as though the longhouse itself listened. They drank mead, chewed hard bread, and laughed with pride, knowing they had raised more than wood. They had raised the promise of shelter, feasting, and law. The foundations were deep, the posts true, the earth bound to the hall, as surely as kin were bound to their king. From this moment forward, the Longhouse was no longer dream but reality, its skeleton rising proud from the soil of its people. The earth had swallowed the sacred posts, and the skeleton of the Longhouse stood rooted in soil. Now came the moment that gave the hall its shape, the raising of rafters, beams, and cross ties. This was the time when timbers left, lying like fallen giants, were lifted into the air, bound together until the house took form. To the people watching, it was as though a great ship had risen from the ground and been flipped upside down, its ribs arching toward the sky, ready to carry not men across the sea, but a king and his kin across the storms of time. The task began with sweat and shouts. Teams of Viking men hauled ropes taut, dragging the massive beams into position. They moved like soldiers in battle, each man's strength needed to lift, balance, and secure the timbers. Wooden scaffolds rose around the posts, and men clambered up with the agility of sailors climbing masts. Below, others braced the beams, driving wedges and hammering pegs until each joint locked tight. The sound was a chorus of labour ropes creaking, mallets striking, and voices calling commands across the clearing. Bit by bit, the frame grew. Rafters slanted upward, paired like arms, stretching to meet at the peak. Cross ties lashed them together, turning chaos into order, fragility into strength. The Longhouse began to loom, no longer a scatter of posts, but a single body, unified and commanding. The king watched as his vision became timber made real, a hall whose bones stood proud against the horizon. Even a Viking child, too young to grasp the weight of kingship, could see that something mighty had been born. The craftsman moved with practiced skill. An adze trimmed a beam here, an auger bored a hole there, while rawhide lashings and wooden pegs fastened each piece. Iron nails were precious and seldom wasted, so the builders relied on joinery older than memory, mortise and tenon, dovetail joints, fittings so exact that no wind could shake them apart. The frame creaked as it settled into place, not in weakness, but as if the house itself were sighing awake. Songs were raised to keep the rhythm. Deep-throated chants matched the pull of ropes and the swing of tools, their verses praising Thor for strength and Frey for prosperity. Sweat streamed down faces, muscles ached, but the sound of song turned toil into triumph. The forest that had once stood wild now towered again, reshaped into a hall that would shelter warriors, women, and skalds. The men laughed through their weariness, boasting that the beams would outlast them, that their great-grandchildren would feast beneath this roof. By dusk, the frame of the hall was complete. Its shadow fell long across the clearing, immense and solemn, resembling a sea dragon beached upon the land. From afar, one might mistake it for the hull of a ship, its ribs reaching skyward, its length vast enough to hold 100 souls within. This likeness was no accident. The same minds that built longships shaped longhouses, for both carried their people to survival. One bore them over the waves, the other bore them through winters, hunger, and war. That night, fires were lit within the frame, though there were no walls to hold back the wind. The glow flickered across beams and rafters, casting shadows that seemed alive, dancing like spirits in the skeleton of the house. Men ate simple Viking food, bread, smoked meat, and broth seated on the bare earth where benches would one day line the walls. They lifted their cups to the rising bones of the hall, knowing they had raised not just timber, but the heart of their people. The longhouse had not yet found its skin, but it had its bones, strong and sure. From this day forth, none could doubt that a king's hall was being born. The bones of the hall rose proud against the sky, but a skeleton alone could not shield its people. To make a house, there must be a roof, a crown of timber, turf, and thatch that would hold back the wrath of storm and the weight of winter. The roof of protection was more than shelter from rain and snow. It was the shield that kept fire alive, kept families safe, and guarded the hall from spirits that prowled the dark. Without it, the longhouse was but ribs exposed to the wind. With it, the king's vision would finally breathe warmth and life. The rafters stood ready, slanting upward like arms raised in prayer. Upon them the craftsmen laid their craft with care, for a roof built poorly was worse than none at all. A Viking man with axe and knife set his skill to the task, trimming poles to fit across the beams, weaving them tight so that no gap would betray them when winter storms came raging. Some halls were dressed in thatch bundles of reed and straw, bound so thickly that the rain rolled off as if the gods themselves had poured oil upon it. Each bundle was laid to overlap the last, row upon row, until the roof resembled a golden pelt, shining in the sunlight, defiant in the storm. Others chose turf, carved in heavy slabs from meadow or hillside. These sods, set thick upon birch bark, grew green again even as they shielded the hall. In spring, wildflowers might bloom upon the roof, so that from afar the longhouse looked like part of the earth itself, rising from soil yet crowned with life. A Viking child chasing goats through the meadow might look up and laugh to see flowers dancing on his own roof while the hearth smoked within. Turf was heavy, but its weight pressed the beams firm, and its thick skin kept out the bite of the cold. For kings with greater means, wooden shingles were carved, each piece split clean with axe and adze. They were laid with precision, overlapping like the scales of a serpent. In firelight they gleamed, red pine or pale spruce catching the glow as though the hall itself wore armour. Some shingles were carved with charms, runes hidden where only gods and spirits might see them. Turning the roof into more than timber, it became a ward, a prayer against ill fortune. The raising of the roof was a labour of peril and pride. Men climbed the heights, balancing on beams no wider than their boots, ropes straining as they hauled bundles up. Below, others shouted encouragement, their eyes never leaving the men who swayed against the sky. A slip could mean death, yet no man faltered, for the hall demanded their strength. Songs rose to steady their rhythm, chants that matched the pull of rope and the hammer's fall. Each strike, each knot tied, each reed set in place was a verse in the saga of the roof. By dusk, the hall lay cloaked, its great body hidden beneath its crown. Rain pattered against the thatch, sliding harmlessly down its sides. The wind howled, but the roof held steady, humming low like a shield in the storm. Inside, the first fire was lit beneath it, smoke curling through roof holes cut with care. Shadows leapt upon beams that now rested safe beneath their covering. Viking food was passed around, meat roasted on spits, bread warm from the hearth, and laughter rose, echoing against the new roof that sealed it in. The people looked upward and knew they were safe. The roof of protection was not only wood, reed, or turf. It was the embrace of the gods, the promise that no storm or spirit would drive them from their hall. From that day forward, the Longhouse was no longer a skeleton of beams, but a living fortress, crowned and unyielding, ready to weather the ages. The roof lay heavy and sure, but a hall could not remain open to the winds. Walls were needed strong, sheltering arms that would hold the warmth of the hearth and stand fast against rain, snow, and the spears of enemies. The walls of wattle and plank rose as the skin upon the Longhouse's bones, each fashioned with the craft of its people and the wealth of its king. To build them was to draw a line between the wild beyond and the life within, a barrier where the world of wolves ended and the world of kin began. In some valleys, where forests were thinner, the builders turned to willow and hazel. Long rods were cut and woven in tight patterns between upright stakes, forming a lattice like the weaving of a great basket. Over this they pressed daub clay mixed with straw, dung, and water smoothed by hand until it hardened into a wall that kept out the wind. The smell was earthy and raw, but when firelight struck it and tapestries hung across it, the wall felt alive with warmth. A Viking child could run his fingers along its roughness and know that this was the skin of his people's shelter, humble yet enduring. Elsewhere, where oak grew in plenty, the king demanded planks. Trees that once reached skyward were split and hewn, their broad boards fitted edge to edge until the walls stood thick as a warrior's shield. These planks resisted more than weather, they defied flame, blunted axes, and stood unyielding when raiders came. A Viking man who sat by such walls at feast felt the strength at his back, as though the very forest still guarded him. The grain of the oak gleamed in torchlight, carved with patterns of knotwork or beasts, a reminder that even defence could be shaped into beauty. Pine was often chosen where it grew tall, its lighter weight easier to raise, its scent sweet within the hall. In richer steadings, walls were clad in overlapping boards, each pegged tight, so rain slid down them like water over a cliff. Some halls even had double walls, stuffed with moss and wool between, keeping out the cold so that Viking food could steam upon the boards without freezing in winter's breath. It was said that in such halls a man could sit by the hearth with snow howling outside and feel as though he were in summer. The raising of the walls was as solemn as it was practical. Men stood in lines, lifting planks into place, their voices grunting with the weight. Carpenters wedged, pegged, and trimmed until the boards locked together like warriors shoulder to shoulder in a shield wall. Each new section enclosed the hall more tightly, each hammer strike echoing like a heartbeat. Women moved among them, bringing water, tending the fires, or smoothing the daub with practiced hands, for the hall belonged to all, and all must give their strength to its birth. As the walls rose, so too did the sense of separation. Outside lay the raw world, wolves, storms, and wandering foes. Inside now stretched a space set apart, the promise of warmth, laughter, and safety. When the first wall was sealed, men sat with their backs to it and spoke in low voices, marvelling at the silence it gave, the way it turned the roar of the wind into a muted murmur. It was as if the hall itself had found its voice, whispering of feasts to come, of songs and sagas yet unsung. By the time the last plank was set, the Longhouse no longer seemed a skeleton nor a half-built ship. It was a living body, bones in the beams, flesh in the walls, breath in the smoke that curled from the hearth. The walls of wattle and plank had turned labour into sanctuary, and in their shelter the Viking king's hall stood ready to face both weather and war. A hall without fire was nothing but timber and shadow. It was the hearth that gave it life, the glowing centre where warmth, food, and story bound the people together. Fire at the heart was not merely a place to cook or keep warm. It was the soul of the Longhouse, the breath that filled its walls and turned it from shelter into home. Without it, a Viking man could not endure the long winter nights, nor could a king gather his kin to feast or judge beneath his high seat. The hearth was set in the very centre of the hall, its position chosen with care, too close to the walls, and flames might lick the timbers, too far from the centre, and its warmth would not reach the benches where men sat shoulder to shoulder. The builders cleared a deep pit in the packed earth floor, lining it with stones that would hold the heat through the night. Flat rocks, carried from riverbeds or quarried from nearby hills, were fitted with precision, for if one cracked under heat, it could scatter embers like arrows across the hall. Above, no chimney pierced the roof. Instead, a smoke hole was left, wide enough to draw the haze upward, but never enough to rid the hall of it entirely. Smoke clung to the rafters, weaving among the beams until the wood grew black and shining with years of fire. At times, it stung the eyes, made a Viking child cough as he played on the floor, but it also cloaked the hall in a veil of protection. The smoke drove out biting insects, preserved hanging meat, and warded off spirits that feared its sting. To endure it was a curse, yet also a blessing, one the people accepted as part of life itself. Once the hearth was prepared, the first fire was lit with ceremony. The king himself struck flint to steel, sparks leaping into the dry tinder of birch bark. As the flame caught, voices rose in chant, for this was more than kindling, it was the birth of the hall's spirit. The fire leapt higher, crackling as though hungry for its task, and soon its glow painted every wall, dancing across the carved posts, flickering in the eyes of those gathered. A cheer rose, deep and fierce, for now the hall was alive. From that day forth, the hearth never truly died. Embers were buried in ash each night to smoulder until morning, when new logs would coax them back to flame. Around it, all life of the hall revolved. Skalds recited sagas beside it, weaving words as the sparks rose to the rafters. Warriors warmed their hands after returning from the hunt or the sea, their laughter loud enough to rival the roar of the fire. Women prepared Viking food there, broths bubbling in iron cauldrons, meat roasting on spits, bread baked in the glow of coals. Children played in the firelight, their shadows leaping on the walls like spirits at play. But the hearth was also a place of solemnity. Oaths were sworn by its light, gifts passed across it as tokens of loyalty, and judgments spoken with flame as witness. To lie by the fire's glow was to risk anger not only from the king, but from the gods themselves. Men swore that the fire carried words upward, smoke curling into the heavens to reach Odin's hall. As years passed, the fire blackened the roof, but it also bound the longhouse in a permanence no storm could unmake. Long after the walls weathered and the roof sagged, the hearth would remain, a circle of stones charred with memory. For while the beams gave the hall strength, it was the fire at the heart that gave it spirit, and it was here, in its glow and smoke, that the soul of the Viking people truly lived. The first fire burned hot in the longhouse, its glow casting life upon timber and stone, but with it came the thick curl of smoke. It clung to rafters, slid along the beams, and drifted heavy over the benches until eyes watered and voices coughed. Yet the people knew this was the way of halls. Warmth and smoke were bound together, one blessing wrapped in a curse. To master the balance was an art of its own, and the builders had their secrets. Light through smoke was their craft, the careful shaping of holes, slits, and clever passages that turned suffocation into survival. At the roof's peak, gaps were left where rafters met, small openings that beckoned the smoke upward. They were never wide, for too great a wound would let in snow and rain, yet the builders knew how to place them so the wind drew the smoke like a breath. In stormy nights, these holes glimmered red as sparks fled into the sky, a sight that made wanderers believe the hall itself was alive, its breath steaming into the heavens. A Viking child, lying awake on the bench, would watch the glow drift upward and imagine the gods themselves catching the sparks as offerings. The walls, too, bore their part. Narrow slits were carved in the planks, thin as the edge of a knife, angled so that wind could slip in, but arrows found no easy path. In the day, these slits drew beams of light, thin and sharp, cutting through the haze like golden spears. Dust and smoke swirled in them, dancing in shafts of brightness, giving the hall an otherworldly glow. At night, with torches mounted high, those same slits leaked firelight outward, warning all who passed that the hall was awake and guarded. Clever tricks turned the smoke from enemy to ally. Bundles of herbs, juniper, sage, or pine needles were cast upon the fire, their fragrant smoke masking the harsher bite and driving insects from the benches. Meat hung high in the rafters, cured in the rising haze, becoming Viking food that could last through the harshest winter. Even cloth and tapestries absorbed its touch, until the very scent of the longhouse was thick with years of fire, a smell both bitter and comforting, as much a part of the hall as its beams. The people grew used to the dimness. Eyes learned to pierce the smoke, to see shapes where others might stumble. Skald said the veil made the hall closer to the other world, the realm of spirits and gods. When warriors swore oaths by the hearth, the smoke rising above them was seen as their words carried skyward. When mothers cradled infants near the glow, they whispered that the haze wrapped the child in unseen protection, blurring the line between the living and the divine. Still, the builders sought balance. They placed vents where the roof sloped low, hidden gaps that could be covered with boards in winter or opened in summer when heat pressed heavy on the hall. Some carved channels in the walls, where air might slip through unseen, fanning the fire, yet keeping the flames from raging. Each choice was born from centuries of craft, passed from Viking man to apprentice, never written, but carved into memory like runes upon wood. In the end, the hall was never free of smoke, it was shaped by it. Light pierced through it in slivers, fire flickered within it, and life was lived beneath its veil. Guests who entered for the first time might cough and wipe their eyes, but those who belonged felt comfort in the haze, as if the hall itself embraced them. For the longhouse was not meant to be clear and clean. It was meant to be alive, its fire breathing, its smoke whispering, its light breaking through in sacred shafts that turned the everyday into saga. When the walls closed out the storm and the hearth gave breath to the hall, there still remained one task that would crown the longhouse with meaning, the placing of the king's high seat. Without it, the hall was only timber and smoke. With it, it became a throne room, a court, a place where law, feasting, and fate itself gathered. The king's high seat was more than wood carved into form. It was the very embodiment of his power, a symbol that his will anchored the hall as firmly as the posts anchored the beams. The seat was always placed with care, never by chance. It stood opposite the entrance, so that any man who walked into the hall first beheld the king before all others. From there, his eyes could sweep the hearth, the benches, and the door, measuring each soul who entered. To sit in the high seat was to see everything and miss nothing, for the placement itself reminded all that the king's gaze reached every corner of the hall. A Viking man who crossed that threshold and met the king's eyes knew at once where he stood in the order of things. The seat itself was carved from oak, chosen for its strength, its grain dark and heavy as if it carried the weight of centuries. Its arms curled like dragon heads, jaws open as if to bite, warning friend and foe alike that the hand which rested there wielded both gift and wrath. Runes were etched into its frame charms for wisdom, victory, and protection. Some said the posts beside the high seat were older than the hall itself, carried from a previous dwelling to bind past and present. To sit there was not only to command men, but to bind oneself to the lineage of kings who had ruled before. At feasts, the king's high seat shone brightest. The fire's glow danced across its carvings, and the smoke curled about it as though reluctant to veil its form. Men seated along the benches would glance often at it, even while tearing into Viking food or raising horns of mead. For when the king lifted his cup, all others followed. When he spoke, silence fell. Even skalds, bold of tongue, paused before the high seat, for their sagas required the king's nod to be carried on. The symbolism of the high seat stretched beyond the hall itself. Warriors swore oaths before it, pressing their hands to the carved wood as if touching the gods. Brides were led to it at weddings, seated beside the king to show the union of kin. Disputes were judged from it, and once the king spoke from that place, no man dared challenge the word. A Viking child who sat for a brief moment upon its edge during play would be dragged away with sharp warnings, for to treat it lightly was to invite misfortune. There were whispers of kings who carved secrets into their high seats' marks, known only to themselves and their seers. One hall bore a throne, etched with serpents, whose eyes seemed to follow men in the firelight. Another was said to creak when a false oath was spoken before it, as though the wood itself bore witness. Whether truth or tale, such stories only deepened the awe with which men regarded the high seat. When at last the seat was set in its place, the hall breathed differently. No longer was it just a gathering place, it became a throne hall, a court, and a sanctuary. The king took his seat, resting his hand on the dragon-carved arm, and all who looked upon him felt the weight of both timber and destiny. In that moment, the Longhouse had not only walls and roof, but a heart, a voice, and a master. And from then on, the king's high seat proclaimed power to all who entered, silent yet undeniable, as eternal as the sagas themselves. The Longhouse stood strong with roof and walls, the king's high seat set like the heart of a great beast. Yet bare timber alone was not enough. Strength was needed, yes, but beauty and meaning gave the hall its soul. Thus came the carvers, men whose hands were as sharp as blades, whose eyes could see shapes hidden within the grain. With knives, chisels, and endless patience, they gave voice to the silent beams. Carvings of gods and beasts flowed across the hall, binding it to the world of men and the world of spirits alike. The sacred posts were the first to feel their touch. Around the base of each, runes were etched deep, calling for protection, wisdom, and fortune. At their crowns, beasts took form wolves, with bared teeth, serpents twined in endless knots, ravens with wings unfurled as if ready to soar into the smoke above. To walk into the hall was to feel those eyes upon you, watching, weighing, never blinking. A Viking man who entered with ill intent might shiver, believing the carved beasts would awaken and strike him down. The doorways bore the most fearsome guardians. Dragons curled across their frames, their bodies winding from lintel to threshold, jaws gaping as if to swallow any foe who dared enter unbidden. Their scales shimmered in the firelight, each line of the carving catching shadow and glow until the creatures seemed alive. It was said that such carvings did more than terrify men. They repelled wandering spirits, keeping the hall free of ill omens. Children whispered that they heard the dragons growl when storms rattled the roof, and though their mothers scolded them for foolishness, even the elders glanced uneasily at the beasts when the wind howled too loudly. Across the beams that held the roof, artisans wove endless knotwork, interlacing lines that had no beginning and no end. These were not mere decorations, but symbols of eternity, the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. The skalds would point to them when reciting sagas, tracing the knots as they spoke of fate's inescapable weaving. Smoke darkened the carvings over time, but the lines never lost their power, gleaming faintly whenever torchlight licked across the beams. Even the benches were not left plain. Simple though they seemed, many bore carvings of shields, spears, or ships, reminders of the life that sustained the people. A Viking child, drowsy with warmth and Viking food, might run his fingers over these shapes until sleep took him, his dreams filled with the ships and beasts his small hands had traced. In this way, the hall itself became a teacher, its walls whispering stories through their carvings long before the skalds spoke them aloud. The king's high seat, too, grew grander under the carver's craft. Dragons curled around its arms, ravens perched upon its back, and runes shimmered across its edges. Each stroke of the chisel was deliberate, each symbol chosen to bind luck and power to the throne. When the king sat there, his form framed by beasts and gods, he seemed less man than legend, a figure set apart by the very wood around him. When the work was done, the hall no longer looked like timber shaped by human hands. It seemed alive, its beams crawling with beasts, its doorways guarded by monsters, its posts bound with spells. The carvers had given it a second skin, one not of wood, but of faith and fear, of story and symbol. Guests who entered gasped, some crossing themselves in awe, others bowing their heads in reverence. For they knew this was no ordinary dwelling. It was a place where gods might walk unseen, where beasts crouched in shadow, where every surface told a tale. Thus, the hall became more than a house. It became a saga carved into wood, one that spoke in silence to all who entered. And as the years passed, even as smoke blackened and edges wore smooth, the carvings endured, whispering of gods and beasts to each new generation, binding them to the Longhouse as tightly as blood-bound kin to king. No hall, however mighty its walls and roof, could call itself complete without doors to guard its threshold. The doors of strength were more than planks on hinges. They were the teeth of the Longhouse, the barrier between kin and chaos, between firelit feasts and the shadows prowling outside. Through them, allies entered with gifts, enemies were kept at bay, and spirits were turned aside. In their creak and slam lay the voice of welcome or warning, and a Viking king knew well that the worth of his hall was measured by how its doors stood against storm, steel, and sorcery. The making began with oak, always oak, for no other wood bore such stubborn weight. Thick planks were split and hewn smooth, pegged together, edge to edge, until they formed slabs broad enough to withstand the heave of many shoulders. Iron was precious, but where the king's wealth allowed, bands of hammered metal bound the wood, riveted across its face like the armour of a warrior. The hinges were no frail contraptions. They were long iron straps driven deep into the timber of the frame, so the door turned slowly, groaning with power, as though it resented every hand that sought to move it. When hung, the doors were more fortress than entryway. Heavy crossbars were fitted inside, logs thick as a Viking man's thigh, sliding into stone sockets so that no raider's axe could splinter them free. At night, when the bars were dropped into place, the sound echoed through the hall like a drumbeat of security. Men sitting by the hearth would glance at one another, nodding in satisfaction, for they knew their wives, their Viking children, their food stores, and their king were locked behind a wall no enemy could breach without paying dearly in blood. But timber and iron alone were not enough. The people feared more than men with axes. They feared the things that crept unseen, trolls of the hills, Draugr rising from barrows, spirits that slipped through cracks like mist. To guard against these, charms were fixed upon the doors. Carvers etched runes along the lintel, invoking Thor's hammer to shatter any curse and Odin's wisdom to blind the eyes of malice. Sometimes the blood of a sacrificed goat was smeared across the threshold at the hall's first feast, binding strength into the wood. Women hung sprigs of juniper or rowan above the frame, for these were trees the spirits loathed, and their scent alone was thought to drive evil away. When the doors opened for guests, it was ceremony. They creaked wide to reveal the fire's glow, and those who entered knew they stepped into the king's world, bound by his rules. Warriors stamped their boots and laid down weapons before passing the threshold, a show of respect that no man, however proud, would dare neglect. When feasts swelled, the doors stood open like arms wide, letting the sound of song and the smell of Viking food roll out into the night. But when danger loomed, they slammed shut like the jaws of Fenrir, and every man within knew the hall was ready to endure. Legends told of doors that held against fire and flood, of others that splintered only when the king's fate demanded it. One tale spoke of a hall whose doors shook each time raiders approached, groaning as if warning the people inside. Another told of a carver who hid the image of a wolf's head in the ironwork, so cunningly shaped that it was only visible in firelight, scaring superstitious foes into flight. So the doors stood, not mere wood, but guardians of the hall, blessed with iron, rune, and blood. Through them passed joy and sorrow, oath and betrayal, but they never ceased to bear their burden. To cross them was to step from the world of wilderness into the realm of the king. To strike them in anger was to declare war not only on men, but on the gods whose charms bound them. And so the doors of strength became as vital to the hall as its hearth unyielding, sacred, and eternal. When the doors were hung and the hall sealed from storm, there still remained the task of shaping the space within. A longhouse was not only beams and fire, not only the high seat of the king, but a place where men gathered shoulder to shoulder, where kin shared bread and mead, where judgments echoed and sagas took form. For this, the hall needed benches. Crafting the benches may have seemed a simple task compared to roof or sacred posts, yet they were the very spine of the longhouse's life. Without them, there could be no feasts, no councils, no laughter in the smoke-dark air. The carpenters worked with steady hands, shaping planks and poles from the forest's bounty. They chose pine or oak, sturdy enough to bear the weight of warriors laden with mail, yet smooth so that the long nights of sitting did not grind the flesh raw. Each bench stretched along the walls, running the hall's length like arms encircling its people. At the centre burned the hearth, and around it the benches formed a ring of order, an unbroken circle of kinship and rank. A Viking man could sit and know his place, whether high-born chieftain at the king's side or humble farmer near the doorway, all bound beneath the same roof. The benches served many lives in one. By day they bore counsels of law. Elders leaned upon them as they weighed quarrels, their voices steady as iron while the firelight glinted in their eyes. By evening, the same benches became thrones of feasting, groaning with Viking food trenchers of bread, platters of roasted meat, bowls of thick broth steaming in the haze. Horns of mead clashed above them, spilling golden drops that darkened the wood, sweetening it with the memory of countless toasts. And by night, when the torches burned low, the benches became beds. Warriors stretched upon them with cloaks as blankets, while women and children curled near the hearth, lulled by the crackle of embers. The benches carried all of life's burdens, law, feast, and rest, without complaint. Carvers did not leave them plain. Edges bore simple knotwork, shield motifs, or runes for strength and plenty. A child running his fingers along them would learn his first letters there, tracing the symbols while listening to his elders speak. The marks also carried pride. Each craftsman left his hand hidden in the wood, so that long after he was gone, his work still bore witness. Over time, the benches darkened with smoke and polish, worn smooth by countless hands, cloaks, and feasting platters, until they gleamed like old bronze in the firelight. The king's bench stood apart, raised higher, flanked by the carved posts, and facing the hall so all could see him. To sit there was to rule, for from that place he gave judgment, shared gifts, and measured loyalty. But even his seat was part of the greater circle, for the benches tied all men together, rich and poor, guest and host, warrior and thrall. Within their unbroken line, the hall breathed as one body. When the benches were finished, the longhouse gained its heart's rhythm. The people gathered for the first true feast, filling the seats with laughter, clamour, and song. Smoke curled above, mead flowed, and the sound of voices rolled like thunder against the beams. In that moment, the hall was no longer an empty shell of wood and fire. It was alive, carried by the strength of those who sat within. Thus, the crafting of benches, humble though it seemed, became one of the most vital labours of all. They were not mere wood, but the foundation of memory and fellowship. Long after the roof grew weary and the doors groaned with age, the benches would still bear the marks of hands and feasts, still echo with the weight of those who had come before. They were the unspoken throne of every Viking, and in their strength the hall found its soul. A hall might rise tall with beams and roof, its benches filled with laughter and fire at its heart, yet without storage it could not endure. The Longhouse was not only a place for feasting and council, it was the stronghold of the king's wealth, the lifeblood of his people in times of hunger, and the proof of his power to all who entered. Storage for wealth was a craft in itself, hidden as much as it was displayed, for in every corner of the hall the goods of survival and the treasures of honour lay guarded by timber, iron, and secrecy. First came the grain, for no wealth was greater than the food that kept a Viking child alive through winter's jaws. Granaries were fashioned inside the hall, raised platforms built upon stout stilts so that rats and damp could not reach them. Wooden bins held barley and rye, their lids sealed tight with clay to keep the grain dry. When the hearth fire glowed, the scent of roasting meat might fill the air, but it was the quiet presence of grain, stored in shadowed lofts and bins, that gave the people true comfort. A king who could feed his hall through the longest frost was stronger than one with 1,000 swords. Along the walls, niches were carved into the timber, hidden behind hanging tapestries or covered with fitted boards. In these rested the finer goods, silver coins from distant trade, ornaments of bronze and amber, small casks of salt worth their weight in treasure. Locked chests stood heavy at the king's end of the hall, bound with iron and fitted with cunning locks crafted by smiths. Only the king and his trusted few knew the keys, and to touch such chests without leave was to invite punishment as harsh as treason. Men swore that in some halls curses were carved into the lids themselves, runes meant to strike thieves with madness. Whether truth or tale, no Viking man dared test them. Weapons, too, were stored with care. Shields hung from pegs upon the walls, their painted faces staring like silent sentinels, while spears stood stacked in ordered rows, ready to be seized at the first cry of danger. Swords and axes, gleaming with care, rested in racks near the high seat. Their presence was more than readiness for war. They proclaimed the hall's strength to all who looked upon them. A guest might feast on Viking food at the benches, but his eyes would always stray to the steel, glinting in firelight, a silent reminder that this hall was no easy prey. Hidden storage was cleverer still. Beneath floorboards lay secret pits, lined with stone and sealed with heavy lids. In these, kings kept what they could not flaunt: silver hacked from foreign hoards, charms brought by seers, even the bones of honoured ancestors wrapped in cloth to guard the hall with their presence. Only a chosen few knew these places, and their locations were passed in whispers from king to heir. Many a raider who burned a hall in greed found nothing but smoke and ashes, while the true treasures lay safe beneath their feet. Yet wealth was not only grain or silver, it was also the tokens of life itself. Bundles of cloth woven by the women, barrels of fish dried and salted, skins of ale brewed for winter, all were stored in corners, lofts, and cellars. The scent of them mingled with smoke and timber until the Longhouse itself smelled of survival. Even humble goods became precious when snow fell thick and rivers froze, and it was said that the hall which stored wisely was as strong as one ringed with stone. Thus, the Longhouse became not only a place of living, but a fortress of plenty. Its benches might groan beneath feasts, but its hidden niches, raised platforms, and locked chests gave it endurance. Wealth slept within its walls, guarded by timber and rune, ready to feed, arm, and protect. And in that silence, with grain hushed in bins and silver sealed in chests, the hall proclaimed the strength of its king more loudly than any boast or song ever could. The Longhouse might stand tall with beams, benches, and doors of strength, yet until the women's hands gave it life, it was still only wood and smoke. The women of the hall carried a power quieter than sword or axe, but no less enduring. Their labour wove warmth into the walls, softened the benches, and filled the vast space with colour and meaning. Without their skill, a Viking man would feast in cold gloom, his cloak stiff with damp, his hall bare as a barn. With it, the Longhouse became a true home, a place where kinship thrived as surely as fire burned on the hearth. Looms were set up against the walls, tall frames where warp threads stretched taut like the strings of a harp. From dawn until the last embers glowed, women worked them, their hands dancing with shuttle and thread. Wool spun from sheep's fleece was dyed with herbs and roots. Reds from madder, blues from woad, yellows from birch bark. Soon the bare timbers of the Longhouse bloomed with tapestries rich in colour, telling stories of gods, battles and beasts. To sit in the hall was not only to feel its shelter, but to see its soul hanging on the walls, woven by women's patience. The benches, too, bore their touch. Where once they were plain planks, hard and unyielding, the women spread furs and woven blankets, making them places of comfort as well as duty. A Viking child might curl upon one beneath a deerskin, listening to sagas by firelight, while warriors returned from raids and sank into warmth, their weariness eased by the softness laid out for them. The simple act of covering the benches turned rough timber into thrones, fit for feast and rest alike. Household crafts touched every corner. Clay pots, shaped and fired by women's hands, stood ready for Viking food broths, simmering thick, grains swelling in heat, mead poured into carved cups. Wooden ladles, spoons and bowls were smoothed and polished, some etched with knotwork that made even the humblest meal feel blessed. Baskets woven from reeds lined the walls, filled with dried herbs, berries, and roots gathered in the green months for use in the long winter. Without such stores, the hearth would have burned in vain, for no fire fills an empty pot. It was women who tended the fire itself, feeding it through the night so no dawn would find the hall cold and lifeless. They sang low as they worked, songs that lulled children to sleep and gave warriors comfort after long journeys. Some believed these songs carried protection, weaving unseen walls as strong as the wooden ones around them. For what axe or shield could defend against hunger or despair? Yet the women's hands did so daily, binding the household together with thread, food, and flame. Even the air bore their mark. Bundles of herbs hung from the rafters, sage, juniper, and thyme, drying in the smoke, filling the hall with scents both sharp and sweet. Some were for cooking, others for healing, still others for warding spirits away. To the men, they seemed simple things. To the women, they were weapons against sickness and unseen foes. In this way, the hall became more than timber. It became a place of balance, where the strength of Viking men and the craft of women wove together into a whole neither could create alone. When feasts were held, the glory of their work shone brightest. Tapestries glimmered in the firelight, furs softened the benches, and platters heavy with food passed from hand to hand. Guests saw not only the king's wealth, but the quiet mastery of the women who had shaped the hall into a living heart for the people. Their hands, though calloused with labour, had carved no less of the saga than axe or sword. And long after the warriors' boasts faded into silence, the thread of their work still bound the hall together, unbroken and eternal. The Longhouse stood at last, its beams darkened with smoke, its roof thick with turf, its doors strong against storm and steel. For weeks the people had laboured, men with axes and adzes, women with looms and baskets, children fetching water and kindling. Now the work was finished, and the hall no longer looked like timber raised from the earth, but like a living beast crouched proud upon the land. It was time for the feast of completion, the christening of the hall with fire, mead, and song. The king himself struck the flint, sparks leaping into birch bark dry as summer grass. With careful breath, the flame was coaxed until it licked at kindling, then roared into life. The fire blazed in the hearth for the first time, its glow leaping up the carved posts, painting dragons, wolves, and runes in living light. The smoke curled slowly toward the roof hole, and the people cheered, for this was the true birth of the Longhouse. A Viking man would remember that moment all his life, the first breath of fire in the hall that was now his home. Mead horns were filled and passed, golden liquid foaming as it sloshed against the carved rims. The king lifted his horn high, his voice rising above the clamour. He toasted the gods for strength, the ancestors for guidance, and his people for their unyielding labour. Then he drank deep, and all followed, the sound of horns clashing echoing through the hall like the clash of shields in battle. Mead spilled down beards, laughter broke forth, and the hall was christened with joy as surely as with fire. The benches groaned beneath the weight of Viking food. Whole boars roasted until their skin cracked, salmon hauled from the rivers laid out on wide boards, bread baked, dark and dense, and wheels of cheese stacked high. Women moved swiftly, laying out trenchers, refilling bowls, and placing steaming cauldrons on the stones by the hearth. The scent was rich and overwhelming meat, smoke, honey, and herbs weaving into one aroma that would forever belong to the hall. Skalds took their place beside the fire, their voices weaving sagas that matched the rising flames. They told of gods shaping the world from Ymir's bones, of heroes crossing seas, of ancestors whose names still glowed like embers in memory. Their words mingled with the crackle of fire, so that it seemed the hall itself whispered the tales through its beams. Warriors pounded the benches with fists, roaring approval, while children leaned forward wide-eyed, their first taste of the sagas bound forever to this night. The king's high seat gleamed in the glow, its dragon-carved arms alive with firelight. He sat straight-backed, his eyes sweeping the hall, watching kin and thralls alike revel in the warmth of their labour's reward. In that moment, his power was not measured in silver or swords, but in the sight of his people bound together by laughter and song beneath the roof he had commanded to rise. Even the humblest thrall felt himself part of the saga, his hands having carried wood or stone that now shaped this mighty dwelling. As the night deepened, the feast grew louder. Horns clashed, songs rolled from every throat, and the rafters seemed to tremble with the weight of joy. Smoke curled thick, yet none minded, for it was sweetened by mead and warmed by fellowship. The Longhouse had proven itself not only a shelter against storm, but a place where life could be celebrated, where kinship could burn as brightly as the fire at its heart. Thus the Feast of Completion sealed the hall's spirit. From that night onward, it was more than timber, more than craft. It was memory and promise, a place that would hold the echoes of countless feasts, judgments, and battles yet to come. And as the fire roared and the voices lifted, the Longhouse itself seemed to awaken fully, its walls pulsing with laughter, its roof ringing with song, its soul bound forever to the people who had given it life. The Longhouse, born of timber, fire, and toil, was never just a shelter. It was a living fortress, a bulwark against storm, hunger, and the steel of raiders. To step inside its doors was to feel more than warmth. It was to feel the weight of protection, the knowledge that the hall itself stood guard with every beam and stone. A Viking king knew well that his people looked not only to his sword, but to his hall, for within its walls lay the strength to endure the cruel turns of fate. Against the fury of fire, the Longhouse was built with cunning. The roof, heavy with turf or drenched thatch, held dampness in its thick skin, making it harder for flame to catch. Rafters blackened with years of smoke became fire-hardened, resisting the sudden leap of sparks. Water was kept close at hand, barrels by the doors, skins near the hearth, so that at the first crack of burning timber, men and women alike could leap to douse it. Some even believed the smoke itself was a guardian, for it clung to beams like a shield, soaking them until they seemed to drink flame rather than surrender to it. Against raiders, the hall's defences were both seen and unseen. Doors of oak, barred with iron and thick beams, could hold against the battering of axes. Narrow slits cut into the walls served as eyes for archers, allowing them to rain arrows upon foes without giving their bodies as easy targets. The longhouse was no castle, no stone tower, yet its very shape lent it strength. Raiders bursting through the door found themselves trapped between benches and fire, hemmed in by warriors who knew every inch of their hall as if it were an extension of their own bodies. Many a tale was told of Viking men who defended their homes with fewer numbers, the hall itself lending them advantage as if the spirits of its posts fought beside them. But the greatest enemy was always winter. Snow piled against the walls, winds howled like wolves, and the cold crept in wherever weakness was found. Here, too, the longhouse proved its worth. Double walls stuffed with moss and wool sealed in the heat, while furs and woven hangings broke the bite of draughts. The central hearth glowed day and night, its warmth shared by every soul who huddled near. Smoke might sting the eyes, but it also carried heat upward, trapping it beneath the roof until the air itself seemed thick with warmth. A Viking child could sleep through the longest night, wrapped in wool, his dreams guarded by the steady crackle of the fire. Even food was a weapon against hardship. Lofted platforms kept grain safe from damp and vermin, while meat smoked in the rafters grew tougher, darker, and longer lasting with each passing day. Ale and mead brewed in casks sweetened the air, their presence a promise that the hall would not fall into despair. The longhouse was a fortress not of stone, but of foresight, its every beam and board bent toward the single purpose of survival. And though it stood rooted in earth, the hall seemed to live. Its doors growled shut like the jaws of a beast, its smoke rose like breath, its benches held the weight of generations. When raiders came, it bristled with spears and shields. When winter pressed, it cradled its people close. When fire threatened, it seemed to fight with smoke and damp, stubborn as the men who raised it. A Viking king could boast of his warriors, his ships, or his silver, but all knew that his true strength was measured in the hall that bore his name. Thus the longhouse was more than wood and roof, it was a fortress of life itself. Within it, laughter roared as loudly as storms, oaths were sworn as binding as iron, and generations found shelter beneath its smoke-dark crown. To its people, it was not merely a house, but a shield, a guardian, a living fortress, unyielding until the end of days. The longhouse was never still. Though its beams seemed unyielding and its roof heavy with turf, it lived and breathed with the turning of the year. Each season left its mark upon the hall, shaping its rhythms as surely as wind shapes the sea. For the people within, the longhouse was not only shelter, but a companion to their lives, a structure that aged, endured, and laboured alongside them. The rhythm of seasons was its heartbeat, steady and eternal. In winter, the hall became a fortress of fire and smoke. Snow pressed against the walls until only the roof showed above the drifts, and the winds howled like wolves at the doors. Inside, the hearth glowed without rest, its flames fed through long nights that seemed to swallow the Sunday. The rafters filled with smoke, black and bitter, yet within that haze lay comfort. Families huddled close, wrapped in cloaks and furs, children curling against their mothers while warriors dozed with spears by their side. Skalds spoke sagas until voices gave way to song, their words carrying through the dim, warm air. Viking food simmered slowly in iron pots, broth thick with barley. Smoked meat softened by the fire, filling the hall with scents that promised endurance. In these months, the longhouse was womb and fortress alike, holding its people close until the thaw returned. Spring brought change. As the earth softened and rivers swelled, the hall opened its doors to light. Smoke holes were widened, furs shaken free of winter's dust, benches scrubbed, and floors renewed with fresh rushes. Repairs were a sacred duty. Thatch patched, planks reset, carvings tended where the cold had split them. A Viking man climbed the rafters, adze in hand, while women spread woven hangings brightened by new dyes. Children scampered about, gathering twigs and bark, turning play into work. With every repair, the hall seemed to sigh awake, as though it too had survived the long sleep of frost and now stretched toward the Sunday. Summer filled the longhouse with light and bustle. Its benches bore traders from distant fjords, warriors boasting of raids, and farmers laden with goods for barter. Smoke thinned as fires burned lower, the hearth now more for cooking than for heat. Doors stood wide, letting in the scent of grass and sea, while feasts spilled into the night air. Viking children ran between the benches, their laughter echoing with the songs of men raising horns of mead. The hall's roof gleamed with sun, sometimes sprouting wildflowers if it was clad in turf, so that from afar it seemed a green hill alive with voices. In these months, the hall was a place of open pride, where the strength of kin and king shone brightest. Then came autumn, the season of burden and preparation. The hall became a storehouse, its lofts and bins filled with harvest. Grain was poured into raised platforms, sealed with clay, apples and roots packed carefully in baskets, fish dried to leather toughness and hung in rafters beside rows of venison. Barrels of ale and mead lined the walls, their scent already sweetening the air. Women spun and wove without pause, ensuring cloaks and blankets would be ready before frost returned. Men repaired weapons, patched shields, and carved new spears. Every corner of the longhouse grew heavy with the weight of provision, its very walls bulging with survival. A Viking man who looked around at the stores knew his family's fate for the coming winter, and a king who filled his hall full was praised as truly mighty. And so the cycle turned. Winter closed the doors tight, spring opened them wide, summer filled them with light, and autumn sealed them with bounty. The longhouse endured through all, its beams blackened by years of smoke, its carvings softened by touch, its benches polished by countless feasts and weary bodies. It was never only timber and thatch. It was a living thing, breathing with the rhythm of seasons, standing watch as generations of Viking men and women passed within. Its spirit was bound to time itself, and as long as the seasons turned, so too would the life of the hall endure. When the day's toil ended and the doors of strength were barred, the longhouse transformed. The fire at its heart roared brighter, its glow painting the carvings of gods and beasts, its smoke swirling beneath the rafters like spirits listening. In that circle of warmth, words took wing. Legends born in firelight shaped the soul of the hall as surely as timber and stone, for here the deeds of Viking men, the dreams of Viking children, and the songs of skalds braided into memory. The skald sat near the hearth, his face half in shadow, his voice rising above the crackle of flame. He spoke of Odin hanging upon the world tree, of Thor's hammer striking down giants, of ships that cut the sea like arrows through the sky. His harp thrummed low, echoing like distant thunder. Warriors leaned forward, their mead forgotten, eyes fixed as if the very gods stepped from the smoke. Each word carried weight, for in those tales men found both pride and warning sagas to guide them in battle, and omens of what awaited cowards or oath-breakers. Yet the firelight birthed more than the songs of gods. Warriors, loosened by mead, added their own boasts to the night. A scar traced across the cheek became proof of a clash with Saxons, a dented shield evidence of withstanding arrows, a raided coast turned into triumph greater than it had been. Laughter rang as challenges were hurled, voices clashing as fiercely as blades. These boasts were not idle. They were the weaving of personal sagas into the fabric of the hall, binding each man's honour to the memory of his kin. A Viking man lived or died not only by his deeds, but by how they were remembered in this glow. Children listened wide-eyed, their faces lit by shifting flame. To them, the hall was a world of marvels, dragons carved in wood seeming to move, shadows leaping across the walls like giants. They curled against their mothers, lulled by tales of far-off seas and ancient heroes. In their minds, the sagas blended with dreams, so that one day, when they took up spear or loom, they carried those firelit memories as guiding stars. A Viking child might fall asleep on a bench, mead horn echoes and heroic boasts shaping the path of his future before he even knew it. Women, too, wove their presence into the moment. Their voices rose in song, sharp and steady, carrying verses of love, loss, and longing. They reminded men of home when their hearts longed for war, and gave the saga's depth by binding them to hearth and kin. Between the booming boasts and the skald's tales, their voices softened the hall, proving that legends were not only made in battle, but also in the quiet strength of survival. The hall itself seemed to join in. The fire cracked like applause, sparks leaping upward as if to carry each word to the gods. Smoke curled into shapes, sometimes of beasts, sometimes of faces, so that even the skeptics crossed themselves or whispered a charm. Every beam absorbed the sound, every post bore the weight of oaths, until the longhouse was thick with the memory of voices. Long after the night ended, the walls still seemed to hum with sagas, as though the timber itself refused to forget. In such nights, the hall became more than wood, more than roof and bench. It was a cradle of memory, a forge of identity. Here, gods and men shared the same firelight. Here, children dreamed of futures carved by saga. Here, the deeds of warriors, true or embellished, became part of the living story. And so the hall endured not only as a fortress against storm and steel, but as the keeper of legend, where every word spoken in the fire's glow bound the people tighter than iron, and where the sagas of the north were born, blazing eternal in the dark. The Longhouse was never built for a single season, nor even for a single lifetime. From the moment the sacred posts were raised, and the fire first breathed at its heart, it was meant to endure. The hall eternal was more than beams and planks. It was the anchor of a people, binding king and kin alike to the earth they tilled, the seas they sailed, and the stories they carried. To walk into such a hall was to step not only into timber and smoke, but into memory itself, where past and present lived as one. Generations came and went beneath its roof. A Viking child once cradled in furs by the hearth might grow to sit among warriors, his voice loud with boasts, then one day take his place on the benches as an elder, quiet, listening to the skalds repeat the very sagas he had once dreamed of. His sons and daughters would in turn inherit the same firelight, the same smoke-darkened beams, until the hall seemed less a building than a living witness, nodding its approval as life cycled endlessly within. The wood bore these memories. Posts were polished smooth by countless hands resting upon them, carvings softened by the touch of fingers tracing knots and beasts. Smoke etched the beams in black, layer upon layer, so that even when the roof was mended, its bones carried the breath of every feast, every oath, every cry of birth or death. To sit in the hall was to feel the weight of those before you, their voices lingering like echoes in the grain. A Viking man might boast of victories abroad, but the hall reminded him that true glory was measured at home, in the strength of kin who feasted beside him. The Longhouse was also rooted in the land itself. Its timbers had once been giants of the forest, its thatch pulled from field and meadow, its turf carved from the very earth the people walked upon. When the hall rose, it was as though the land had taken shape around them, enfolding them in walls that belonged as much to the soil as to human craft. Even in ruin, when roofs sagged and doors splintered, the remains of a hall never felt dead. Grass grew over its mounds, but beneath lay the memory of laughter, the warmth of feasts, and the echo of songs. The earth itself remembered, as if unwilling to let go. Kings measured their power not only in silver or ships, but in the halls they left behind. A hall that endured after his death was his true legacy, a fortress of memory where his name lived longer than his bones. Here oaths had been sworn, disputes judged, and alliances sealed. Here the sacred fire had been kept alive through endless winters. To lose such a hall to flame or foe was to lose more than timber. It was to lose the heart of a people, a wound deeper than any battlefield could carve. And yet, even when halls fell, others rose upon their ashes. Each new hall carried traces of the old, a reused beam, a sacred post, a carved rune. The saga of one generation was carried into the next, the hall reborn like the cycle of seasons. Thus, no hall ever truly died, for its spirit passed into the next, eternal as the stories told within. So the Longhouse stood smoke-dark, fire-warmed, carved with gods and beasts, alive with voices. It was more than shelter from storm, more than fortress against raiders. It was the soul of the Viking world, a place where king and kin alike were bound together in wood, earth and story. And though men's lives were short and fragile, the hall endured, eternal, as the living heart of a people whose memory would never fade.